It started with a headline no one expected to read. Missing bride returns from the dead after 5 years. But that was only the story the world knew. The real story, the one no one printed, began the night Juliana Reyes-Abramov, 29, climbed out of her own grave. Figuratively, at first. Literally, later. 5 years earlier, she'd been declared dead in a car crash off the Pacific Coast Highway. The vehicle had plunged into the ocean, no body recovered. Only a torn wedding veil caught on driftwood. Her fiancé, Cole Abramov, grieved publicly and remarried within a year to Juliana's best friend, Sophie Chen. What no one knew was that Juliana hadn't died. She had watched the wreck burn from the cliffs above. She'd planned it. She hadn't wanted to disappear at first. She'd wanted justice. But justice, she learned, doesn't break a man. Oblivion does. So she spent years creating hers, a ghost made of silence, patience, and surveillance. In Guatemala, she sold jewelry under a false name. In Morocco, she learned to counterfeit documents. In Lisbon, she met an art dealer who owed her a favor and gave her a new passport. By the time she returned to California, she wasn't Juliana anymore. She was Mara, a quiet, untraceable woman with a scar across her collarbone and a plan that was no longer about grief, it was about choreography. She started with small things. Anonymous messages to Cole's firm hinting at fraud. A letter to Sophie's gallery about misappropriated art. A fake obituary for Sophie's sister published online, just to watch panic bloom. Then came the gifts, black roses delivered to their doorstep every Friday. Each tied with a white ribbon embroidered with the date of their wedding. Cole began unraveling quickly. He told Sophie he saw Juliana in crowds, in reflections, in dreams. Sophie called him paranoid. But one morning, she woke to find their bedroom mirror etched with the words, "You replaced me too soon." The police found no intruder, no fingerprints, only saltwater residue on the glass. A week later, a courier arrived at their door with a small wooden box. Inside, Juliana's wedding ring, still wet, still smelling faintly of the sea. Sophie screamed. Cole just sat there, pale, shaking, whispering her name like a prayer he'd forgotten the meaning of. That night, he received an email from an untraceable address. "You always said you loved me to death. Let's test that." Juliana watched from a rented apartment across the street as he read it. She didn't smile. Revenge wasn't pleasure anymore, it was anatomy. A study of what happens when guilt replaces air. And as she lay in bed that night, listening to the ocean beyond the window, she whispered to herself, not in mourning, but in completion. "He buried me once. Now I get to decide how deep he goes." By the second act, Juliana Reyes-Abramov, still hidden under her alias Mara, had perfected the art of haunting without presence. She didn't need to show her face. She existed as a sequence of near-impossible coincidences, a perfume lingering in Sophie's car that hadn't been sold in 5 years, a voicemail with her laughter spliced into static, a half-erased wedding photo that appeared in Cole's office drawer. They started whispering her name again in town. People loved a ghost story more than the truth. Cole's mind began to split between guilt and superstition. He couldn't sleep. He started visiting the cliffs where she'd died, leaving white lilies at the guardrail as if the ocean would absolve him. He didn't know that she stood nearby in the fog, watching, unrecognizable in a black hood. Her expression calm, not cruel, not kind, just clinical. Revenge was no longer rage, it was ritual. Sophie, meanwhile, felt the weight of his unraveling. Their marriage turned brittle. She caught him staring at the sea from their window for hours, whispering things she couldn't hear. When she confronted him, he screamed at her for using Juliana's perfume, though she hadn't worn it in years. "You brought her back," he said, shaking. Sophie laughed bitterly. Maybe she never left. That night, Juliana left a USB drive on their doorstep. On it, a video, grainy, filmed from inside their bedroom. It showed Sophie sleeping, Cole awake beside her, staring into the camera as if he could see whoever was filming. The timestamp was from the night before. Sophie called the police. They found no break-in, no camera, no prints. The footage was traced to no known device. The detective suggested trauma, maybe shared psychosis. But when Sophie replayed the clip later, she noticed something new, the faint reflection of a woman in the mirror behind the bed, wearing the veil Sophie had kept locked away since Juliana's funeral. Cole's breakdown came fast after that. He started recording himself sleeping, convinced Juliana was watching. In one of the recordings, his own voice whispered her name in the dark. Then a reply followed. Soft, unmistakable, hers, "I am." Sophie found him one morning sitting in the living room, surrounded by water. The faucets were off, the windows shut, but the floor was slick, salt-stained, like the sea had seeped through the walls. He was muttering, "She's under the house." When Sophie tore up the carpet days later, she found something small pressed into the wood beneath, a seashell, wet, its inside engraved with the words, "Still breathing." That was when Juliana knew she had him. Fear had turned to faith. He believed in her death more than her life, and that meant he would follow wherever she led. And she wasn't finished. Not yet, because ghosts only win when the living start to confess. By the third year, Juliana Reyes-Abramov had become more myth than woman, a haunting wrapped in precision. Under her alias Mara, she had reduced Cole to a shell of a man and turned Sophie into collateral damage. But guilt, she'd learned, has a half-life. Once it eats everything it can, it starts feeding on the one who planted it. She told herself she wasn't cruel, only thorough. Yet lately, she'd begun waking at odd hours, convinced she heard her own name whispered in the dark. Once, she thought she saw movement in her apartment mirror, a flash of white fabric, the shimmer of her old veil, but when she turned, there was nothing. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe the performance had started to believe itself. Meanwhile, Cole was unraveling publicly. The newspapers that once mourned him as a widower now called him unstable. He'd been found wandering the cliffs barefoot, muttering apologies to someone unseen. Sophie had left him, her own reputation ruined by whispers that she'd faked Juliana's death for the insurance payout. She sent Juliana one final message, an email, untraceable but desperate. "If you're still alive, please stop. He's already gone." Juliana didn't answer, but she read it a dozen times. Something about the way Sophie had written "please" made her stomach twist. She didn't want mercy, she wanted closure. Yet the line between the two had blurred long ago. That night, she went back to the cliffs for the first time since she'd staged the accident. The ocean below was black glass. She carried a flashlight, though she didn't need it. Every wave sounded like her name. She stood there for hours, imagining the moment she'd walked away from her old life, the heat of the explosion, the smell of salt, the weight of the rings she'd thrown into the sea. When she finally turned to leave, she saw something impossible. A single rose on the guardrail, fresh, dew clinging to its petals, tied with a strip of white silk embroidered with her initials. Her breath caught. It couldn't be. Only she used that ribbon. A car engine started somewhere behind her, its headlights flickering across the fog. For the first time in years, Juliana felt something unfamiliar, the cold pulse of being watched. The next morning, she found a note slipped under her apartment door. No name, no address. Just 3 words written in block letters, "You taught me." She laughed, nervously at first, then uncontrollably. Because for the first time, she realized the one rule of revenge she'd forgotten. If you play dead long enough, someone will eventually bury you back. That night, she locked her doors. She checked the windows twice. But as she turned off the lights, her phone buzzed once. A new message from an unknown number, a photograph of the cliffs, empty. Except for her flashlight still lying there, beam pointed toward the sea. The caption read, "Your turn to haunt." By the 4th act, Juliana Reyes-Abramov was no longer the hunter. She had become the ghost inside her own revenge. For months, she'd felt eyes on her, reflections that lasted a moment too long. Doors that clicked shut without wind. The faint scent of Sophie's perfume in places Sophie shouldn't have known existed. It was impossible. Sophie had moved to London, started over, vanished like Juliana once had. But the mind, she knew, doesn't need proof. It just needs repetition. She started keeping her curtains closed. Her neighbors whispered about the woman who lived upstairs, who only came out at night and carried salt in her pockets. She told herself it was superstition, protection, a ritual to keep ghosts at bay. But deep down she knew, she'd invented ghosts, and now they were her only company. Then came the footage. A small envelope, no return address, slipped under her door. Inside, a USB drive. She almost didn't plug it in. But she did. On the screen, grainy night vision footage showed her sleeping in her bed. The date stamp was from 2 nights prior. A figure stood beside her, tall, still, indistinct. At first, she thought it was Cole. But the longer she stared, the more it looked like her. The same posture. The same scar on her collarbone. Her own face watching her sleep. She ripped the USB out, threw it in the sink, doused it in water. When she looked back at her reflection in the window, the outline of the figure still lingered behind her for a heartbeat too long before vanishing. Days blurred. She stopped eating. She dreamed of drowning, of hands pulling her underwater, familiar and cold. In one dream, she saw Cole, not broken, not weeping, but calm. "You did it," he said, smiling faintly. "You became the story." When she woke, the smell of sea salt filled her apartment. The next morning, her front door was ajar. On the floor lay another white ribbon, the same kind she had once tied to the black roses she sent to torment him. But this one bore new initials, C.A. Cole Abramov. Juliana laughed, half disbelief, half hysteria. It was impossible. He couldn't have known. But when she called his number out of instinct, it went straight to voicemail. The automated message said the line was disconnected. That night, she returned to the cliffs, drawn there like a tide. The ocean below shimmered silver under the moonlight. She found footprints in the wet sand, her size, her stride, leading straight to the edge. And stopping. She looked around. No one. Only wind. Only water. Then, a sound, a low, mechanical hum. She turned toward it. A drone hovered above, its camera blinking red. On its side was a sticker, the logo of the Mirror Foundation. She whispered the words she hadn't said in years, trembling, "I didn't forgive. I just forgot who I was punishing." The drone tilted slightly, as if nodding, and then dove toward the sea. The impact echoed like applause. Juliana stared at the black water, the reflection of her own face fractured by the waves. For the first time, she couldn't tell if she was the survivor or the haunting. Behind her, unseen, another ribbon caught in the wind. This one blank. No initials. Just a faint scent of salt and lilies.